Now, what we're going to talk about next are the tools that support reproducible science. There's not just one tool, there are dozens, if not even more than that. So I'm going to highlight the ones that I use at this point almost like on a daily basis. And then I'm going to pause to see if there are other tools that aren't on here that you all use. So just to start, reproducible science tools could be things like R, could be things like LaTeX and Markdown, programming languages like Python or its implementation with Anaconda. It could be version control through GitHub and GitHub Pages. You can create virtual machines to host your code like you would do using Docker or you would do in the cloud with like Azure VMs. You have things like infrastructure as code. So this is the idea that I not only write a web application, I write in code the type of computer it needs to run on, and I write a deployment script so that anyone could, at the click of a button, have a version of my VM and its contents all in one place. So that's the infrastructure as code idea, and I might talk about it more at the end. Then there are things like integrated development environments like Visual Studio Code. And there are high-level things like the Open Science Framework where we pre-register analyses. And then there are documentation engines like Dockersaurus that allow us to make clear why we did certain things. And then finally, we have code-based experiment creation software like Open Sesame, like CyclePy, like JSPsych. So I'll pause here. Is there anything on here that you're hearing for the first time today? Feel free to raise your hand or say it out loud. Docker, thank you. Source. Okay. So Docker is a code-based way of specifying a computing environment. So it's everything from the version of Linux to the Linux packages that you install to the version of Python that should be running in that environment, all the Python packages that should be running in that VM, and then every other related specification. So if you have two VMs that talk to each other, you would specify all of that in your Docker file, or actually in two Docker files. And so it's a way that I could not only give you my code pipeline, I can give you the computer it should run on. And so it's a powerful idea because having the code is good, but if you take that code and then run it 5 years from now and it doesn't work, that's not so good because it's no longer reproducible. It was reproducible in that moment it was created and almost never again. So Docker allows us to be reproducible nearly forever. And I say that because Docker recently got bought out and they're restructuring their business model. And so I imagine that soon there's going to be a open source Docker, the way that Docker previously used to exist. And then Dockersaurus is a documentation engine created by Facebook that allows you to use Markdown syntax, and it generates web pages. So rather than you having to like code up web pages and specify links and styling, you just focus on the content and it creates the entire scaffolded website for you. It's related, although different, to how I generated the textbook for this workshop. I used an analogous software called Bookdown. And so in the future, I foresee that you're going to see these tools become more popular and there will be more alternatives. Right now, we're in a space where it's like Docker, and then there's like one other thing that's like newly emerging. But I can foresee VMs becoming more accessible and more code-based. Yep.
So in other words, you can go and say, I this type of computer, this is my operating system. And do they give you options to do that on the website, or you just put it like just encompass your whole environment from your own specific computer? And like, how does that exactly work?
Gotcha. So it's more the first approach that you mentioned where it's almost like, imagine you have a menu of operating systems and you have like links almost to like their build. And so you specify the exact build. What you're describing on the other side, where you have like a replicated version of your machine, would be something done through Oracle's VirtualBox, to where you can take a snapshot and load that snapshot. So Docker is it's more syntax based, and it's more starting from scratch. The other approach you described is, I have something, whether it's my laptop or desktop computer, and I want to hand it off versus what is the minimum amount of code and infrastructure needed to run this product, whether it's a web app or a DICOM visualizer or something. So yeah, we can maybe on day 3, if we have some extra time, I can show you a couple Docker projects, because it sounds complicated, but it's actually like 5 lines of code to do what I'm describing. So it can be a powerful tool, and I think we'll probably have time on day 3. So those are all, softwares and different tools provided by different companies. I'll kind of ground you all in something that I think is super important to learn as soon as possible, and it's Markdown. So just by show of hands, have you heard of Markdown before? Markdown. Okay, yeah, and I get the impression that a lot of people know Markdown through R Markdown. So let me just allow, sorry, I'm doing like room management stuff. There we go. So Markdown is like the superset language that R Markdown is based on. Markdown was created back in 2004 by John Gruber, and it's now become one of the more popular programming languages because of how useful it is to document process. It might be hard to see on the slides. There's a link at the bottom if you want to check it out. But for example, if you want to specify a link, you put the concept that you want linked in square brackets. Thereafter, you put the link in parentheses, and there you are. You now have a link that's clickable. The same way that if I wanted to show italicized text, I would put an asterisk before and an asterisk after that piece of text that I wanted italicized. Or if I wanted it bolded, I would put 2 asterisks on each side. But in general, this means I am not clicking around in Word to highlight a piece of text. I am saying this piece of text needs to be bold, so I'm going to put these operators next to it. Or I want to make this a superscript, so I'm going to apply the superscript syntax, and so it'll make the 2 be at the top. And so, again, this means that you're no longer clicking around and using a GUI, you're applying syntax to format your documents. I've gone all in on Markdown. So at this point now, some processes that I'm working on with Gabby and Steven and some others, it's all in Markdown. And the textbook that accompanies this course is entirely in Markdown. So I've somewhat bought into the Markdown future. It's also what GitHub uses to render the README pages. So I feel like if someone like Microsoft that paid, however many billions of dollars to acquire GitHub thinks it's a good language to learn, I think I also want to learn it. So I encourage you all to check it out, and we'll be going over Markdown syntax throughout the workshop. Yeah. All right. Next, we'll talk about what is Git. So Git is a version control system to manage code edits, branching, and collaboration. Git is in and of itself an open source software, but a lot of companies have now branded a version of Git. And so the one that I'm sure most of you are aware of already is GitHub. It's the product owned by Microsoft. There's also GitLab, which is just owned by someone else, but it's the same idea that somebody took the open source product and wrapped it and added new features. But you can also always feel free to use open source Git. It's easily installable. Now, the more important side of GitHub are these concepts here. So I'll spend a few minutes going over them now, and then we'll go into a GitHub demo in just a couple of slides. The first concept is this idea of a repository. Think of it at some level as just like a folder, but it's a folder that then becomes publicly or privately accessible to whoever you'd like. So a repository can contain many folders, many files. A repository often contains what I call secret files like gitignore and gitkeep that do very specific things in the Git version control system. So by default, if you put 10 files that were CSVs in a repository and you made it public, those 10 data files would be public. Now, if I put those 10 files in that repository and I added a gitignore file that said ignore all CSVs, then those 10 files only live on your computer. They never got pushed publicly. And so I'll say that the most important step in creating a Git repository is the gitignore file. If you don't do this right, you're improperly sending data to GitHub, which is probably bad for many reasons, including IRB reasons. And so it's really important that you're mindful on how you create your gitignore because you can improperly expose your data. Yes, Stephen?
So an example of this would be if you have all the raw data from the experiment and has some type of identifiable information in there, you may use your code to read in all that raw data and have it in one big sheet or whatever. But you put git ignore on those specific raw data files, so those don't get uploaded pictures. Overall summary of it all compiled together with stripping all the information. Would that be an example?
That's exactly it. And so I'll just give you a specific example. The pipeline we're working on for the DICOM to JPEG, it has that built in. So on my computer at home, I have all the DICOM images, but the pipeline only has the empty folders and the code. So it's almost as if I would give you an instruction like go on Teams, download the data, drop it here, and then hit run. And so on GitHub, all they have is code and folders. You have your PII data stored elsewhere, and you just bring it in to the appropriate folder. So yeah, that's a good example. And I'll go over this now. We're going to do like a couple walkthroughs of these concepts in just a minute. There's a git keep file. So a git keep file is telling GitHub to keep an empty folder. And this sounds silly, but imagine you're trying to create a template for someone, and it's, all right, make a data folder, make an output folder, and make a scripts folder, but you don't have stuff to put in there to give them. You just want to show them the structure. You need to put a git keep file in there, because otherwise what they will see if you push all that to GitHub is a blank repository. So it's really important that if you want to keep an empty folder, that you put a git keep file inside. And I'll show you how to make those today in just a bit. Now, with Git, there's this concept of committing code. And what that mostly means is you're snapshotting that code in that moment, or those files or those folders in that moment. And so you're basically saving it. And I'm careful on using the word save, because when you commit something, you're only saving it as a version difference from the last version on your machine. It's only when you push the code that then becomes quote unquote saved on GitHub or on GitLab or wherever you use Git. And so when you want to save something and make sure it's like live in the cloud, you need to both commit it and push it. Pulling is the exact opposite, where I have some code on GitHub and I want to bring it down. I want to download it to my computer. And then finally, there's this concept of a diff, or a difference, and that ends up being line specific between any two commits on GitHub. So if I wanted to take the diff of my last change and my first change, you'll see a lot of difference, because you're comparing a really old piece of code and a new piece of code. But if you're looking at a commit that happened 5 minutes ago, what it'll end up showing you or exposing is what did you program in the last 5 minutes. And that's often really helpful if you're working in a really large code base or you're working with other people. You kind of need to know what you edited when, especially if you made a mistake and introduced a bug. It's a nice, easy way to find those bugs.
You don't have to press the undo button a lot. So
yes, exactly that. All right, so almost to the point where this becomes interactive. We talked about OSF a bit. It's a place to register, study, designs, hypotheses, analysis plans, and scripts. So the multi-lab replication study that I mentioned gave us all the materials on OSF, and we also then uploaded all our results to OSF. And so the entire experience is open. Anyone can go and see file history to know that I uploaded something on July 6th at 8:14 a.m. Like, it would all be snapshotted on OSF. You can also use OSF as a post hoc curation or documentation warehouse for your studies. And so I kind of buy into both. I have some studies that I've in fact pre-registered, and everything is up there, all the way from the RAWs form, Qualtrics export, all the way through the final modeled analysis data set. And I also use it in this way where I'm just like done with the study and I want to warehouse everything and give a person a link. I want to be able to say, if you want to learn about this study or see this code, here's this one link and everything is there. So I encourage you to think of using OSF in either of these two ways, although ideally you'd use it in both ways. Just by a show of hands, has anyone used PsycArchive before to store one of their papers? So PsycArchive is a preprint library or repository where if I'm about to publish something, let's say in the Journal of Assessment, and I want a snapshot of that paper before the reviewers got to it, I'll put it on PsycArchive. It gives me a DOI, which means I can throw it on my CV as a preprint. I mean, I guess I can do that anyway and just put on my website, but it becomes a little bit more official. It also allows the science to be open immediately. So like you finished your paper and you just put it up, rather than you finish your paper, you go through reviews for a year and a half, and then you get it out. So it's a way of disseminating the information early. It has its drawbacks, and some of them might be obvious. It also means that people can see the science you're doing and do the same science. And that's not always something that's, appropriate. So I say, if you're thinking of using PsycArchive, definitely talk to your mentors about it, get their perceptions of it, and see where it fits into your research program. This is something I've only recently started to do as of like this year. So I'm working on a paper with a colleague, and we've gone through already a couple rounds of reviews, and it seems like we're going to have a couple more rounds of reviews. So it's like from the point where we wrapped up the experiment to now, it was maybe a year and a half, 2 years. So at one point we just got motivated enough to put on PsycArchive, so we at least have something to show for almost 2 years of work and essentially slow review process. So yeah.
Is it good for, I guess, when job applications or applying to grad school, it's like, hey, in prep, and then you can write the DOI to it and you think, oh, cool, let me look and see what that is, to kind of give you a leg up.
Exactly, it's exactly that. So like, anything that you have in prep on your CV, if you'd feel comfortable, you then, like you said, have a DOI associated with it. So it's not a promissory note of like, there's a mythical paper out here somewhere. It's, here it is, here's the paper, read it in its current form. And again, that has its strengths and weaknesses. I think the biggest thing that it shows is that you're open about your science, and that in this modern culture that we're in, I think can go a long way. Especially because a lot of funding agencies are requiring this. So like it's a principle that whether you apply it this way or you apply it with OSF, you want to find a way to apply it to your science in a way that makes sense. But just be mindful that it's out there. Like I can show you later on a preprint that anyone can download, anyone can do anything with our methods, like today, our code today, even though we're not published. So it's a thing to at least think about. Yeah, Gabby?
Any discussion of anyone steal their idea, or
That's the most common criticism is, why am I going to do that? Someone's just going to replicate my experiment and publish first.
right.
And so there's totally that concern built in. I think there's different ways to go about it. Yeah, they did it and they published it, but then you publish your paper too. Like almost kind of like, what does it matter that both we have a paper on the same topic? But I get the scientific overlap and the stepping on toes problem. Like it is a thing, and in general, I'll say use it wisely. Like Stephen said, maybe you're going on the job market and you want to show some of these papers that are close, but you don't want to wait to show it because it might be a year of waiting until the reviews are come in. So it could be strategic, but I think also it's a way of releasing protocols about your study. So imagine that you use PsycArchive as a way to document the methods, and maybe you only open source that, and then maybe the results stay something like private. And so there are ways, like hybrid ways, I guess, of using PsycArchive. I think especially in that protocol way, it could be helpful because at least in large research groups, like the Einstein Aging Study group that I'm a part of, anytime that anyone wants to use our ambulatory cognitive measures, everyone from scratch writes the ambulatory cognitive measures method section, shows the same screenshots of the same tasks as the same trial parameters. So in a situation like that, it would probably make sense that we PsycArchive our protocol. And now anytime anyone wants to talk about those methods, they can just point to that URL and say, hey, more details here. I'll give you my overview or summary. So there are ways to use it strategically and to not expose science that, maybe not ready for the limelight. All right, so hopefully now this is when this starts to get a little bit more fun and interactive. We're going to jump into GitHub, and I'm going to go over a couple concepts that I think are going to be really important, echoing these ideas of repository and committing code and git ignores and all that. So we'll jump into GitHub. I'll largely drive on my end, but if you downloaded the slides, I think this morning or even just now, there might even be a link in the bottom that shows the repository we're working with. So everyone on Zoom, bear with me. I'm going to do a little bit of screen sharing and unsharing to get this right. So that's like really tiny. So I'm gonna just keep increasing the font until it seems legible. Yeah, if you can do that, please. Does that look okay, or maybe a little bit larger? All right, I'll probably leave it there. Thanks, Stephen. So this is a GitHub repository that I've created as kind of like a sandbox to troubleshoot and think about these GitHub concepts. So first, what I'm going to do is walk you through the gitignore file. So let me kind of go through line by line. And first, let me just check in. Can people on Zoom see the code that says Context Lab GitHub 101? Okay, thank you. So the gitignore file is where you specify all the things that should not go on GitHub. So I'm going to just let me share my whole screen because I think this might be easier to go back and forth. I'm going to go on GitHub and just show you what's there now. So we have a data folder. We have a secrets folder. We have one of these annoying Mac DS store files. We have a gitignore, a README, and a notes. Now let's go inside of the data folder. The data folder is empty. And so we'll kind of now work backwards to how we got there. So in the gitignore file, I essentially said, ignore data. And I didn't put anything after it because I'm saying ignore the whole folder. I could also be more specific. And so let me just now go through the motions of creating a new folder. Let's call it data 2. In this case, the second I put any file in data 2, let's say it's a text file, it'll be available to go on GitHub if I wanted it to. So let me just make a fake CSV real quick. Or maybe a fake text file. Yeah. So I'm going to go over to GitHub just to show you what's happening. So I realize that's a little bit tiny. So GitHub is basically telling me that the only file that I have ready to push is fake.txt. And again, that's because of the specification that I set up in the gitignore file. I have all CSVs being ignored, and I have the data folder being ignored. But since I didn't make data 2 ignored, it's showing the file inside. So now what I'm going to go ahead and do is say also ignore data 2. Let's go to GitHub. And now you'll realize that the gitignore file has been modified to say the word data 2, but the other file that used to exist in that list is now gone because I've ignored it. Now let's just go through those motions a different way. Let's say I want to specifically ignore fake2.csv. Well, fake2.csv doesn't exist. And so now the file that I was previously ignoring is now available again. And so I'm not pushing any of this to GitHub yet on purpose because I want to show this like interplay between changing the setting and what shows up on GitHub. But in a minute, we'll get that all pushed. Now, so how you would use this in your study is often by saying ignore the data directory or ignore specific file types in the data directory. You would also use this if you have what are called secrets in your project. So if you are interacting with, I don't know, the Nintendo API and you have a Nintendo API key, you probably don't want to put that on GitHub because then anyone else that gets access can do whatever they want with the Nintendo API key and they can be emulating you. And so often you want to also have your secrets get ignored, like I've done here. So in this case, the passwords file, let's just make one. And so if we come over here to GitHub, you realize that's not showing as a change because I've gone out of my way to make the passwords file ignored. Now, where this gets tricky is, let's just say, for example, you're testing something quickly and I don't know, you call it, let's see, passwords copy. Now you have one that you've gone out of your way to ignore and you're working really quickly and all of a sudden you create this other one and you push to GitHub. Now you've pushed those secrets. And so it's really important to, as you're adding new things to your GitHub repository, think about how that fits into your gitignore strategy. If you're cloning a file like I just did sloppily and I created a passwords copy, realizing that I have passwords.txt hard-coded in my gitignore. If I want it to be safer, I can maybe come to my gitignore and say, ignore all text files. And so I don't have to think about it as much. Any text file I put in there is ignored from the beginning. And so it's just really important that if you're thinking of using GitHub for your code and data management, that you carefully, locally on your machine first, play around with the gitignore file until you get it right. Before you ever push your first commit, I encourage you to just do this slowly and carefully. It could be the reason that all your data ends up on GitHub and now you need to like delete your repository and all of that. So it's just really important that you think about this carefully. It seems like a silly old text file, but if anything, it's the most important text file when you're working on GitHub. Yeah, of course.
The asterisk that refers to like, that's like all, it's like the, so the slash, does that refer to like a file within a folder?
Correct.
Okay, and then, that all CSV files, will that like, that will be anything in all of your, like, everything? You
Exactly.
could just put any create a new CSV file and it's just not gonna,
Exactly.
okay. And then this is all just saved to your computer.
Right, locally, and let me show you how I can demonstrate that in GitHub. So here in GitHub, it's showing me my changes, and it's also asking me for a summary. The second I hit commit, it's a snapshot on my local machine, but it's not on GitHub yet until I push it. And so this is a safe place to test until you feel like you've gotten that right, and then you would commit, and then you would push, and then at that point, it's all locked in a sense. You can undo stuff and you can delete those files after, but something that I'll expose in just a few minutes is the version history, and actually the fact that on GitHub you can go back to the beginning of that repository creation. So if you create a repository, you mess up early on, you make your secrets public, and then you delete it and do a bunch of other stuff, I can actually go back to the first commit where your secrets were public and grab them. And so if you make a mistake where you push something to GitHub that you never intended, keep in mind that it's in your version history, and safest might be to delete the whole repository so someone can't go all the way back. But yeah, great questions, and you had that all right. I'll do one more thing here, and then I'll actually commit this. Here is the history tab, and so I use this as an opportunity to talk about GitHub in my class. So I actually have some earlier commits. But you'll actually, as I was mentioning a second ago, be able to see every commit from the initial one where I just published a README in a license file, all the way through every single edit I made as I was explaining GitHub in the class. So it really is, it's helpful in this way, but in the way that we were just talking about, it could actually be detrimental to the way that you have your IRB written or something else. And so it's really important that you walk through your gitignore strategy carefully. I think that's it for now. And so let me just show you a git keep file. It is blank. There's no magic to it. It's just a file that has that specific name. So it needs to start with a period, and it needs to say git keep as all one word in lowercase. If you write git keep in capital, it's not going to know what it is, and it won't do what it's supposed to do. So I always use Visual Studio Code because I can create a new file of any type by right-clicking and saying new file. If I was using like TextEdit or something else, like it might default to .text. And so you need to like save it as a .text, go into like your computer's file explorer and rename it, and then put the dot in front of it yourself. So that's a little bit hacky and clunky. So I find that I always just tend to use Visual Studio Code to do this. So just like that. In this case, I already have one in there, so I can't make another one, but it would be like that you create it. So let me push this because I want to show you a couple other things. So now we're going to go ahead and look at it on GitHub. So realizing that we have a data2 folder now with a fake.txt file because I removed that from the gitignore. And in terms of the version history and the commit history, if you come here to the little clock, you'll see exactly what I mean, that I can go back and look at any commit historically within this repository. I can look at the commits themselves and what was changed and what was added. I can also copy the SHA or the digest or the hash of that commit in case I wanted to document or share with a collaborator, hey, the code you're looking for is in this commit. Here's the SHA code or here's the commit code. So it's a way of communicating about the snapshots. I think this is all for now on GitHub, other than just saying that there are a ton of more features that are more helpful if you're collaborating in large teams. If you're working mainly by yourself or with a couple other people, a lot of what I went over today just works, and you don't need much more than that. Where you might start to get into the realm of tapping some of these, so to speak, advanced features of GitHub is if, for example, you want to work in multiple branches of your code. So GitHub has this feature called branching where, like, let's say as an example, main branch is what's public, let's say on a website. And then I can have a dev branch where I'm like testing something out. All the files on my computer, if I like come here and say I'm on the dev branch, get like copied over. Let me just go through the motions here. So let's make a dev branch. We'll publish it. So now I'm going to open up Visual Studio Code and you'll realize that it's the exact same repository. All I did when I created a new branch was saying, hey, this folder here, call it this thing, call it dev. And just as easily, I can come back to main. And now I'm back on the public facing branch of the code. And just as easily, I can come back to dev and make a change. So let's just maybe go through the motions and I'll put something in here. Let's say data 3 is now in the gitignore. Well, that's only a change on my dev branch. And so let's just briefly walk through what would happen next. I'll commit it. I'll push it. And now I'll come to main. And in this case, I can merge dev into main. And so you're then bringing the changes that you've made in a safe place into your public facing version of that code. And so if you're like experimenting with a new feature or you're doing something fundamentally different than the other code, it's important that you probably work in a branch. Because if you're working with others, that's like where code changes become breaking changes. Like if I don't know, I'm adding a new feature to a sensor processing stream that calculates standard deviation in the mean, and my original pipeline only calculated the mean. If somebody else downstream is using the new version of the code and their data sets or data pipelines are expecting one column, and I now gave them 2, I might have broken something in their code. Sean, I think you might have had a question.
Yeah, in this case, you're still functioning from the same physical folder on your computer.
Yes.
You are just changing where you're going to be like making those changes.
Exactly. So thank you for bringing that up. It's the exact same folder on your computer. It's almost like behind the scenes. It's like tagging those files as like dev. And then when you come in here in the GitHub desktop app and switch back, you're changing that value behind the scenes to now be back on main. And then there are ways to bring changes over from one branch to another. There's ways of saying, I want a specific file from one branch, but not everything else. And so that's where GitHub gets like more complicated and like learning the syntax to do those very specific things. Like I mentioned a minute ago, if you work on main and you're working by yourself, that's probably enough for most projects. And if you're working with others, I'd suggest probably using branches if you're working on different features. So you'll find your groove as you kind of work, with GitHub more, but like just to go finalize this step here today. If I wanted to, yeah, here we go. So now I'm going to go ahead and merge dev. So we made a change and we added a new value in the gitignore called data3 to ignore a folder called data3 that doesn't exist. And now what I'm going to go ahead and do is say, merge the dev branch into main. And so I'm basically making a record that not only did I make that change, I'm saying the change probably works. So let's bring it up to the live production version of the code base. And so now I've successfully merged dev into main. And now I'm going to push it. And so now it'll be on GitHub in just a second. So if I go to GitHub on the desktop, or sorry, on the browser, and I open up the gitignore file, we see that data3 is there. So that was a change I made in a specific branch, and I copied it, so to speak, to the main branch. So I think that's maybe it on GitHub for now, and I'll pause to see if there are any questions, anything I can clarify. So I'll say, try GitHub out with like low stakes or no stakes, like just make a repository and like I did today, make a bunch of fake CSV files, make some fake password files, and try what we just did now, like yourself, like go through the motions of committing something and revising your git ignore and pushing that up and making it public. And then verify with friends, like, hey, can you see this file? Because you shouldn't be able to. And go through the motions a few times, and eventually it'll become a lot more organic. I'll say I do almost anything in code that I do lives on GitHub. Like I no longer use OneDrive for code management or SharePoint, or even my local machine. Like if I'm doing something that I feel like is worth my time, it's on GitHub, because I feel like then at some point feels valuable to me, it'll be valuable to someone else. And I just now have a link that I can give. Or if it's a private repository, I can add you to the repository and you can see everything and edit everything. And so I encourage you to think about GitHub as a warehouse for your code, a warehouse for your pipelines, and even just a warehouse for like folder templates. Like sometimes you're working on a certain type of project, and then you might work on a similar type project 5 years from now. You might have a folder template that you could reuse then. So I do that a lot. Like if I'm developing like a JS-Psych experiment, I actually have a JS-Psych starter template that I work with, and I like merge that into newer projects. So I don't have to like write each line of code from scratch. I just have like a starter bundle and I just append to it. So GitHub has changed my life. I wish I would have started using it sooner. I embarrassingly can say that I only started using it 3 years ago. And I've now like seen the light. I now see GitHub for what it is. And again, I wish I would have started sooner. So I encourage you all to like, just try it out. It'll feel weird. It'll be clunky at first, but it's definitely going to be worth it. So Stephen?
To kind of follow on with what you did, to go to like section 3.3 GitHub cheat sheets, would that help me follow along, do that? Or is there a textbook I should be following? Try to recreate this on my own?
Yeah, I think the GitHub cheat sheets will get you a long way. I think a lot of those cheat sheets are written for GitHub with commands, and I use GitHub Desktop. So
Okay.
I'd encourage you to try out the desktop app first, and then as you get more comfortable, it'll maybe even be easier for you to write those commands, or like build them into your R pipelines and things.
So short of Googling GitHub desktop walkthrough, do you have a link for GitHub desktop walkthroughs? You just kind of recreate the terminology and go over it again, what you just did.
So the terminology is in the markdown that you described. I'll have to find a video and make it available. I don't necessarily have many resources beyond that. Yeah, so I'll find something to make available.
Yeah, because I was trying to go through with you, but a lot was just like getting used to the interface. Like, where's this? Oh crap, you're viewing this. I don't see that. Let me go to the view button, open this up, and by then I was already too lost to follow along with it.
All right. So we're going to jump in now to Endnote. And Endnote is very near and dear to my heart. I, for a very long time, managed my references by hand. I feel like I just want to say that out loud. It's terrible because you make mistakes. You make mistakes like you took out an end-text citation, but then you didn't take out the reference at the end of the manuscript, or vice versa. Or all of a sudden your mentor advisor says, hey, change the format. I don't want APA 6th edition. I want JAMA. And now you need to redo your formatting for your references. And that's frustrating. And so I've gone through the gamut of Zotero and Mendeley. When joining the faculty here at UCF, I did some orientation and learned about Endnote. Like that's the software we have here and have a license for. So I decided to take a deep dive and make this a part of my research to not only learn how to use Endnote, but to hopefully eventually become a power user of Endnote. Because man, I really hate cleaning references by hand. So what we're going to do today, just for a couple minutes, kind of like we did with GitHub, is just to go through the motions of how I use Endnote to support reference management. I find that this is one of the biggest pain points I have when working with students, more so in the sense that if you don't do your references this way, you're stuck memorizing almost formats and how many authors should be in a list and how do you format the journal names and where does volume go and where do you list the publisher information. And so it removes a lot of that, memory constraint and it forces it to become a very simple process. So I want to go over my process with you in just a minute. Any questions, or maybe we can just spend a minute chatting about if you might use another reference manager? Yeah, go ahead.
So I used to use Zotero, so it's free. And I stopped using it and started going by hand because I found that maybe it was only as good as the input I put in there.
Mhm.
So like if I got the volume wrong or the author wrong or whatever, because sometimes you scan the web page and then grab it. Sometimes the scan the web page couldn't grab it perfect.
Mhm.
So then I have to go through and manually change it. And if I miss something and forgot about it, I go through and change it throughout my Word document. Oh, I got this wrong. And then if I go to write my Word document again, it re-uploaded the problem in there. And it got too clunky with that. So I said, forget it. I'll just do it all by hand and memorize how to do it. So that
Got
I
it.
quit. And maybe Endnote is better than that because Zotero is free. So
Got
that's
it.
why I stopped.
Yeah, so I mean, I think with all these reference managers, they do have their quirks, and EndNote's quirk is syncing. Sometimes it's like, hey, you have something to sync, and I'm like, no, I already did that. And it's like, no, you have something to sync.
Yeah.
And then I say, sure, and then it freezes. And so there's little quirky stuff like that that I'll say that hopefully gets improved over time. But why don't we jump in? So UCF has a website where you can download EndNote from their campus site license. So you don't have to pay for anything. It's kind of auto-magically hooked up with the UCF license and all that. So if you haven't done that already, here's a link to download it, and I'll pull it up here on my computer so that we can jump in. EndNote X9 is what used to exist when I first came to UCF, and now it's EndNote 20. So they've had 11 stages of evolution or some weird branding thing. So we're going to use EndNote 20. Some people in the chat saying EndNote's the best. I agree. So, a syncing issue. It's like my password's wrong, and it is, and I actually changed it recently. So they're right about that one. So can folks on Zoom see the screen with the EndNote? Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. So this is the EndNote interface. On the left, you have a sidebar that demonstrates the groups of references. And so you have an all references catch-all, which is quite literally all of them. You have recently added, which I think is within the last 7 days. You have unfiled, which are any references that have not been put into some kind of grouping structure, whether it's a collection or into a specific manuscript. And then we have groups that could be where you organize references in conjunction with like other collaborators. So like when I was writing a grant recently, we created a EndNote group for all our pollution project references. Shared it with my collaborator, he can load it on his machine. And if I add a new reference, it also shows up there. So it's a really nice way of keeping references together amongst research groups. Another cool thing about EndNote is that you can find the full text often for most references that you add. And so if you, like, just as an example, went to Google Scholar, found an awesome paper you wanted to cite, you clicked download EndNote reference, and you dropped it in here, by default, it wouldn't have an attached PDF. It would just be the citation, like the metadata for the citation. But then for any one of those references, you can actually right click and say find full text, or you can select the whole list and say find full text. And I think in like 40% of the cases it'll find it, and the other 60% you're left dealing with login issues or other intricacies, which mean you'll have to find the PDF yourself and manually attach it. So I would say it's helpful, but sometimes you're still doing the manual work, although I'm happy to go find a PDF and insert. It saves a lot of time otherwise. I think that's all I wanted to show about the interface. So now what I'm going to do is go through the motions of finding some papers on Google Scholar and bringing them into EndNote, and then taking that EndNote citation and carrying it into a Word document. So using it practically like if I was writing a manuscript. So, so let's go ahead and go to Google Scholar. Can folks see my Google Chrome screen on Zoom? Thank you. All right, so who wants to suggest a topic for this literature review?
Medical image perception.
All right. All right, so let's say we want to cite this current perspectives article. Let me make this a bit bigger though. So too big. So you'll click the citation button. How I used to do this in the olden days was copy the APA citation, bring this to my Word document and hit save, and thought that I had done a thing. Part of the issue with that is obviously like if I no longer want to cite Krupinski, then I got to go find it. Remember that I don't want to cite this person anymore. Find it, delete it, but delete it in 2 places. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to come down here in the bottom of the site interface, download the Endnote file, which gives us an ENW file. From there, I would go into Endnote and I would go to the file menu to import. I'll then go ahead and find that download, that ENW file. And there we are. So now I have this article by Elizabeth Krupinski about current perspectives in medical image perception. And so let's just say I'm writing a literature review on this topic. So I'm going to go ahead and now find Word on this computer. All right. So the first thing I'll want to do is write something of substance. So and let's say that there was something that Dr. Krupinski said, and I want to cite it. So I'm going to go into the Endnote 20 menu of Microsoft Word. This comes with the installation of Endnote 20. So like as you're going through the motions of the installer, at some point it'll say, hey, I need to install something into your Word. And if you hit OK, you get this toolbar in Word. It works most of the time, and it's a little bit laggy. And so you might even see that live here today. So I'm going to go ahead and see if I can try to make the toolbar bigger. No, apparently not. So it's the top leftmost button. It says insert citation. That'll then open up this window that allows you to search inside of your local EndNote library. And so again, I think it was Krupinski. So I'll just type that. And so here's where it just kind of takes a little bit. If you have a largish library, it could take anywhere up to like, 30 seconds or so. So we wait. It has what I would call a cold start problem. Like if this is the first time you're using EndNote for that day, it might be this slow, but then every other reference thereafter is a little bit quicker to load. So anyway, Krupinski loaded. I'm going to go ahead and say insert. And what that does programmatically is that it inserts the in-text citation. In this case, I have JAMA format. And then it also adds a references page appropriately formatted to, in this case, JAMA style. Now, let's go through that use case where you were, I don't know, in JAMA style and your advisor said, actually, we want APA 7th edition. Or I don't have 7th, let's say 6th. At the click of a button like I just did, I just changed this one reference. Now, sounds silly almost with one reference, but imagine you had like 500 references or 100 references in your dissertation. That simply, you can change the format. And so I think that's powerful. So why this is important, especially this changing formats piece, when you're writing a grant, like let's say it's to NIH, they typically don't care what reference style you use. And so the reference style you use almost becomes a strategic decision with respect to how much space you want to save. So in a grant that's 6 pages, of which the first page is like an intro for your specific aims, you have 5 pages to squeeze all your content, power analyses, justification, information about your team. So at some point you have a trade-off to make. Do I want APA citations that are long and verbose? Or do I want a citation in like JAMA format that just gives me a superscript, like a number 1 or a number 2? And so in a grant that I recently wrote, it was completely a strategic formatting decision to change formats, but it was something that happened late in the process. So if I was doing this all by hand, I would have literally been like, crap, now I gotta do this all over again, remove everything from the format it was in and make it JAMA format. So not always do you have like the perfect reference style in mind when you're working with other collaborators, and neither do they. And so sometimes these decisions happen post hoc, I don't know, 5 days before the grant goes in, and then like you're freaking out to like get that all fixed. And so this is a situation where EndNote really saved. EndNote is just amazing. So that's, I think, most of what I wanted to share. There are other features with EndNote, like you can categorize your references. You can say these are all background information. These are all methodological details, and you can kind of echo that in how you like show the references. So there are other features that I've yet to kind of dig into, but what I just went over now in a couple of minutes is the basics that I think could help you get started to using a reference manager, as soon as today. Let me see if there's something else. I think the last thing that I wanted to say is you might eventually be in a situation like I just described a few minutes ago with that grant, where you need to make a hybrid reference style. So the only thing that NIH does require is that every citation has what's called a PMC ID. It's the public access ID number for your paper in NIH's repository. So if you get grant funds from NIH, they want you to make your articles open access, you'll have a PMC ID. And so if you're writing a grant, let's say you're citing yourself from one of these open sourced articles, and you don't have the PMC ID, it's not considered like valid. It's like, sure, it's an article, it's cited, but it doesn't have the thing that we're looking for that tells us that it's been open source as part of the grant mandate. And so I had a situation where I had to take JAMA format because I wanted the superscript numbers, the 1 and the 2. And then I also needed NIH format because I wanted the references at the bottom of the manuscript to show the full PMC ID. So I had to like take 2 reference styles that were actually written in code and like merge them, like copy and paste and like stack them. And so there could be situations like that where, you're in a very specific moment writing a grant or trying to save space and you need to combine reference styles. It's almost as simple as like editing a couple text files. So that's more of like an advanced or super user feature of EndNote. But if it ever comes up, I'd be happy to talk about that with you and share the code that I use to generate a new style. Let's see. Yep, so I think that's everything with EndNote. So I'll pause here to check in to see if there might be any questions from folks on Zoom or folks here with us. Yeah.
So I think that I'm just looking at this pulled up, like the space that's like annotated, like assuming that's where you had notes about the patient record. So I guess, did you know much about that aspect of it? Because I do still do like all this by hand, which pros and cons, but like I have, spreadsheets that have like the citation, and also like lots of notes. And I use that to like, search through the thing if I'm looking for a specific keyword or something. So can you do that with EndNote where like you put notes on different parts of the like paper, and then you can just like Control F or search or something for all the articles that have that like note in it?
Gotcha. So let me work through that. So yes, in general, there's a way to add notes to EndNote. So there's one way that's inside of like the metadata of the record. So I'm going to try to pull that up now. Yeah, here it is. So essentially every citation in EndNote has a notes field. So like you could specify it there. It's clunky though, because as you see, it's like one line. Like it's not like a paragraph view that you can see like everything that's in there. You need to like paginate down with your keyboard. And so that's frustrating. So yes, you could put notes. It's not the ideal interface for notes. Now, I think you mentioned also like the PDFs. You could attach PDFs, although I don't think the search feature looks inside the PDF. It maybe only does like a file name search.
Because I just like do notes like this, like the summary of the method, summary of whatever, and like sometimes when I'm like thinking of a specific term or something, I'll search within my own Excel file. So I guess like that's the question. Is like if you put notes into this, would you be able to search for like the ones that had the participants of the specific type of like if you wrote the note yourself, to be able to search like your own information? I'm like, well, also I guess there's a search bar, so like I'm assuming you can search for the specific, like if there's something in the title or whatever, but like if it's the phrase that you're looking for.
I'm gonna give it a try. This isn't something I've ever used, but I like how this like where this could fit in. So give me a second. Yeah, research notes. Okay. So this was a fail. I totally wrote the words participant test and I cannot find it now. It is in a column called research notes. So I'm wondering if there's another record down here somewhere else. Oh yeah. So I was using one called notes and there's a research notes. Okay, so I wonder if it'll show up now. Yeah, it did. So yes, the search feature works if I use the right field. The interface isn't ideal. So maybe it still makes sense to have that Excel document with your notes, and maybe like when you're done or you're about to like publish the manuscript, merge them over is one thought. But yeah, I mean, if you have a system that works, like keep doing that. I don't know. I wish there was a better way to edit and work with these notes. If you figure it out or I do, I'll be in touch, because I think this is where I do something like what you describe. I typically have like a Google Doc accompaniment where I have like some of those excerpts, and it would be nice to kind of consolidate everything to one place.
Oh, and so we probably still need two separate things, so like I know. It's like, yeah, my Excel file, I look through, I'm like, oh, like, mistakes and stuff, and taking it, so it's kind of like using them together, so.
Do you experience importing libraries from other citation languages to Endnote? Is that?
I've never done it. There are tools, I think, built into Endnote, because they have, if you go to import, there's like an options screen where you can select like the where it's coming from or the format. I previously did everything by hand, so I didn't have a thing to import. I'd be curious though, because I have some students that use Mendeley, and I'd be curious if I can convert them over. So if you learn, oh, that's what you're using. Oh, okay. Gotcha. I'd be curious if you find a way to do that, let me know, because I think that'd be helpful to a lot of the students.
Yeah, and I'm not sure, I don't know if you just covered this, I'm sorry, so, but in Mendeley, one of the features I like to do is you can highlight the PDF.
Oh, okay.
And then add notes and in a share group folder that is accessible. That you can add this share directly in there.
Oh, wow.
So I found that to be highly useful, but I mean, being able to insert in text citations is absolutely like the best possible feature. So
Yeah, and I don't want to give the wrong impression that I've like gone all in on Endnote. It's what I learned when I got here, and it's what's been working. But that sounds like a feature that I would switch over for. Like if I'd be able to like highlight something and say, "Hey, Gabby, go look, I highlighted this." Like that's really helpful. So if you can just share maybe an email, like just like a link about that feature name, I can do some more reading about it.
It does look, I just, that it should be able to export directly from like that.
Oh, nice.
you can build that in here, just have it with the notes on it, be able to share it that way, be able to write it easily.
Oh, that's really neat.
It's kind of the system operating.
Long story short, if whatever you all use, it's no longer by hand, like that to me is a win. So whether it's Mendeley, Zotero, or the next greatest reference manager, just do that.